Have you noticed when you try to do something, it's always harder to start doing something than to move on while you're doing it? What may seem so difficult to you to do may come around to be a lot easier for other people. Those people we consider to be talented or better than ourselves in what we do. But what if I tell you a quite essential thing? And that is, difficulty is not about talent. It's about resistance and how we deal with it. In this video I'll explain to you how resistance works and how to deal with resistance. By knowing it, you will know how to deal with hard things and figure out now what to do if you tend to struggle with getting a hard thing done. By presenting you a 3-step process that will help you in order to overcome the resistance towards a certain task. But before we proceed with the video, I want to ask you to subscribe to my channel, because this enables me in order to create new videos. We are currently at 30 subscribers, which I want first of all to thank you all for supporting this content. Now, without further ado say, let's proceed with the video. Now, the first thing we need to know about resistance is that resistance is a coping mechanism towards negative emotions. It helps us deal with the stress. It helps us overcome the pain when we tend to face something which we would consider hard. And this makes a lot of sense because for the human being, we are evolved to avoid the things which make us feel bad, but to embrace the things that makes us feel good. But instead of saying that we should just push through a resistance and push through the pain, I want you to consider something else. Instead of trying to run away from the pain and just get through it, I want you to come to consider to understand the resistance and to understand the pain in order to deal with it. This is the first step within the process, and it is to understand why. Why we tend to avoid the things that we tend to avoid. Why does it make us feel bad? And what exactly about the work makes us feel bad? Is it the case that the work that you intend to do makes you feel incompetent? Or is it that the project makes you think that you will fail either way? Perhaps dealing with the task may cause you distress. Perhaps it may remind you something of your childhood. Or it may create another different anxiety. Knowing the reason for it is so important, because knowing what you tend to avoid will enable you to deal with it. In fact, interestingly, what we tend to avoid is not the work in of itself, but the meaning we try to avoid from it. For example, you want to eat more healthier and decided to change your diet for the better. But even though if you want the idea of eating healthier about yourself, still the food that you tend to enjoy may give you relief from the stress. It makes you feel for a moment really good, because the food that you tend to avoid has also a symbolic value of relief, that if you remove yourself from it, you consider it to be as a loss or as a form of distress that you still want to recreate. This is especially why change is so difficult. Even though we tend to create a change for the better and want ourselves to change for the better, what we often tend to ignore is that our change may hide some part or aspect of our life that we have found value in the first place. Let's say you have a habit of playing video games, and playing video games so often that you tend to neglect your work. Now, what video games may do to you is not only the pleasure of enjoying the game, what may also do is that video games may be something you tend to be really good at. And at work, you tend to feel really incompetent. So what the video game does, it creates you this relief from feeling not incompetent. And so even if you tend to avoid the video game, thinking, alright, if I stop playing video games, I will feel much better, you're actually bringing out a pain that you tended to avoid with playing those video games. And this is really important because it reveals a very important fact about procrastination. And that procrastination is a practice of suppression. The suppression of an emotion, the suppression of stress, the suppression of anxiety that we tend to relate towards work. Because this is the quite essential thing. Resistance is built on fear and suppression. In fact, fear is that which causes the suppression in the first place. Which brings us to the second step of the process, which means to accept the emotion we tend to avoid. Now, by accepting, I don't mean to just don't give a damn about the emotion, or just to give up trying to solve it. To accept means in this case to embody it. Instead of trying to run away from the emotion, we want to embrace it, what we tend to fear and avoid the most. And you can embrace an emotion by doing a certain practice called negative visualization. Now, if you may be familiar with Stoicism, negative visualization is a practice where you try to imagine multiple negative scenarios in order to prepare for a scenario mentally before it happens physically to deal with the stress. Negative visualization has another great value, and it's because it's creating peace within ourselves, because we learn to accept the negative emotion we tend to avoid. And as fear that tends to suppress it loses its basis from what we tend to suppress it. In this sense, negative visualization is a mindfulness practice around the emotion we tend to avoid. The more mindful we become of what we tend to avoid, the more capable we will be able to act in greater self-control of the things we try to do. Now, doing both of those steps doesn't require much more than just 5 minutes or 10 minutes of each. Now, you can identify the negative emotion rather quickly by figuring out what you exactly tend to avoid and then just sit with the emotion. You can think of it almost like in meditation, where you try to sit down and embody yourself as much of the emotion as possible. You try to embrace it as much as you can. Now, this may feel bad in the beginning, but what it will do to you is that it will create relief and calmness in the long run, because you no longer have a basis from that your procrastination tends to build itself on. But once we know what we tend to avoid and we learn to accept the feeling, now comes the third part and the most important part of all of those three. And this is to act. Action, creation. But in order to act, you should first of all know what you want to do. And this is the difference between a general goal where you try to figure out how to do something and an actionable plan. With an actionable plan, you know which step to take and when, so you won't get disorganized and get yourself lost. This is in fact what makes most of the things so difficult, is that we are usually incompetent of knowing how to deal with a situation. So when you try to do something hard, it's always about figuring out what to do and losing yourself within the anxiety, than to just figure out the right thing to do and just get it done in 5 minutes or so, or what we tend to express for around 3 hours or so. But in order to do this thing, we have to distinguish a goal from an action. As if within an action, we know exactly what to do, and it's as simple as acting something out. So we can do a simple practice there. Now, all you would need would be a piece of paper or a pen, but you could also use word operator or even a to-do list even. What I want you to ask to do is to write down the task you want to do. Now choose the task which you tend to avoid the most, and then figure out what actionable steps you could do in order to achieve the task. Now those clarified and actionable steps and actions should be as simple and obvious as possible, so you wouldn't get yourself lost if in trying to implement it. Now give yourself 5 minutes around this practice. Write down every single action you can come to think about for getting this one task done. And then once you've written down the list, just begin starting out within each and a little action. But you may come around and saying, alright, so I did this practice cons, but I still don't know how to finish this task. I still don't know how to implement it. I know some actions that I could do in order to get this task done. But what the problem is with a lot of difficult and hard tasks is that we don't know actually always what to do with it. And because some tasks are so difficult and complicated, we have to figure out and iterate our approach multiple times. And this is alright. You won't always know everything that you have to do. But you can always bring yourself to the position of knowing from where to start. So even if you may not know everything that you look forward to do within a task, you can just write down some simple steps that you will start yourself doing. And then once you've done those steps, you can just get back to the practice and reiterate, alright, what am I going to do now, or what am I going to do differently? Don't get yourself lost. than trying to figure out always the right step to do. Having a simple plan is oftentimes better than having a perfect plan if you tend to waste a lot of time on it. So to sum up with what the 3 steps are in the process, you have to first identify the emotion you tend to avoid, and the second of all, you have to create peace within the emotion you tend to avoid. It's causing all this resistance. Once you've dealt with this entire resistance, you then create an actionable plan and just implement on the actions you already figured out. If you've done this, you can repeat this third step and just move on within your practice. And this would be pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed the video and hope that it could help you on with your difficult task you tend to face. Thanks for watching.